Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we're covering something that I've wanted to cover for a while. We're just going through a top 10 list, or in this case, top 11 list, of builds for Honor Mode. I'm going to be doing a basic overview of what I think the 11 best builds in Baldur's Gate 3 are for winning in Honor Mode. We'll go over the strengths and weaknesses of each of them, what draws you to play them, what broken mechanics they have access to that make them some of the most powerful builds in the game. I will not be doing full build guides for each of them, but I have done full build guides for each of them, and will link those videos in the description so that if you want to do a deeper dive into any of these characters, you can go check out my full build to that character. I think this will be a really useful resource if you're just looking to find some builds that will be extremely powerful and a good core to build a party around. All of these builds are absolutely strong enough to carry a party through Honor Mode, so you can combine them with characters that are a little more flavorful or less optimized, or ones that you just think are really fun, in order to still have a really excellent shot at winning, because these builds are so strong. There are tens of thousands of builds in Baldur's Gate 3, so the top 11 are really the very, very best of the best, because there are just so many builds. So if you don't see your favorite build on here, don't worry, it is almost certainly still excellent. This is just my pick for the 11 best builds in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, as you know, the important thing about jokes is that they're always funniest the third time you tell them. So this video comes out of people really liking my optimized character build videos. So I thought if I do a video that teaches you which characters are the most optimized in Baldur's Gate 3, then... Oh no, I've messed up! I keep doing this! Alright, well, I guess we just have to forge ahead. So what does best even mean? Obviously, this is an extremely subjective term, so when I say what are the 11 best builds in Baldur's Gate 3, what are we actually talking about? Do we mean highest damage? Do we mean most hit points? Do we mean fastest move speed? Do we mean prettiest? Any of those could reasonably be defined as best, so we need a working definition if we're talking about what the actual strongest builds are. I'm going with a very simple criteria for this video. By best build, I just mean the easiest build to win with. I think that that is the most useful criteria to judge an Honor Mode build by, not like how much damage does it do on a perfect turn or anything like that, but just will it win the game the highest percentage of the time. If you are, especially if it's your first run through Honor Mode, or you're relatively newer to strategy games and haven't memorized all the encounters or anything, we just want the most powerful builds that will get you through the game. I think there are three important criteria to consider when we're looking at how easy it is to win the game with a build. First up, power. Obviously, damage does matter. So the raw power of the build, how much damage it does, how good it is at controlling enemies, how tanky it is, how high is its armor class, how good are its saving throws, all of those things are incredibly important when we're looking at how strong a build is. Secondly, resiliency. What this means is how good is this build at recovering from bad situations, incredibly bad die rolls, poor RNG, bugs, because this is still a game where bugs happen relatively frequently and sometimes can put you in bad combat situations as a result, play mistakes, having had a couple beers before you sit down to play. Any of those things can put you in a bad situation, and so a strong build that's easy to win Honor Mode with will be resilient to that kind of setback. And finally, easiest to play. What I mean by easiest to play in this sense is both how easy is it to avoid making play mistakes, how complicated are the decisions that you have to make, and also how smooth is the actual gameplay through Honor Mode. Can you make the story choices you want, or are you required to make specific ones to get certain items? Can you choose specific different party members with it, or do you need certain types of party members in order to support the build, that kind of thing. So basically the smoothest run through Honor Mode I think is also important, because this is still a game, you want to be able to have fun with it, so a build that lets you do that I think is going to be better in my opinion than ones that don't. Alright, I can now hear the sound of thousands of YouTube commenters sharpening their pitchforks because the intro has taken longer than a microwave burrito. So In the interest of saving my own life, let's get right into the top 11 builds for Baldur's Gate 3. In number 11, I have placed the Lockadin. Lockadin is a mixture of Paladin and Warlock that uses Warlock spells, which refresh on a short rest, to get extremely high damage smites much more often than another Paladin build will. In this way, you get both the best things from Warlock and the best things from Paladin, and combining these two characters gives you a character that is extremely powerful and also extremely versatile. I've put the way that I suggest building the characters here at the top, so this is sort of the most common build, but then there's also some alternate level splits that I've included with several of these builds. The main strengths of the Lockadin are the incredible burst damage that you get. Being able to spend high-level Warlock spell slots on Smites, because you can spend up to 4th or 5th level Warlock spell slots on Smites, increases your burst damage massively. You also get incredible control. Because you are Charisma-based on all of your stats, both your attacks and your Charisma, and your spells use your Charisma, so you get to be a character that both has maxed out attribute points for their melee attacks and also maxed out attribute points for their control spells. Most notably, Command, but also things like Evard's Black Tentacles can really help your party lock down enemies, and the Paladin and Warlock together get access to a whole bunch of the best control spells in the game. If you also go for a Great Old One Warlock, you get a lot of free fears because this character gets to use critical hits to its advantage. You will often be attacking with advantage thanks to abusing darkness. That means you'll get a lot of critical hits. That means a lot of fears at a very high save DC because it's based off your charisma, which is maxed out. You can see there's a lot of internal synergy with this build, which is why I think it's so powerful. You also get an excellent ranged attack because you just get a fully powered up Eldritch Blast. So you get to also just be a great ranged attacker when you can't close to melee or don't have a relevant control spell. So this character is extremely versatile in that it does some of the highest burst damage in the game in melee, has an excellent ranged attack, and has some of the best control spells in the game. And those all operate off of a single attribute, so you don't have to use any items or anything in order to make them extremely powerful. You also get access to Paladin abilities depending on your level split. That can include the high-level Paladin auras that increase your saving throws, or just give you the Paladin abilities from the Paladin Oaths, which are pretty powerful in and of themselves. Getting the permanent advantage from Oath of Vengeance or the healing from Oath of the Ancients can be really excellent. Getting the extra damage from the extra damage based on Charisma from Oathbreaker Paladin, all of those are really excellent options for the Lockadin that will power up your character significantly. I also have a special mention for Hunger of Hadar here just because it's a game-winning spell. It's relevant throughout the entire game, so getting access to it quite early as this character does and having being able to just spam it out is very powerful. You do pay for this character's strengths in some ways, mostly that it is primarily a melee character, which is definitely a downside for an honor mode character. It means that your positioning requirements are harder, it means you're more likely to be in the line of fire of enemies, so generally speaking, it's easier to play with ranged characters than with melee characters, so that's a minor downside for sure. And it has a relatively slow early game development path, because you need to hit 3rd level Warlock for Pact of the Blade in order to actually attack with your Charisma, and you need to hit at least 5th level Warlock in order to get extra attack, and you need to hit at least level 2 Paladin in order to get Smites. So it's not really until level 7 that this character fully comes online. You're still very powerful up until that point, but you nevertheless are a little bit slower than a lot of these other builds, which I have put a lot of effort into emphasizing being very strong in the early game, because that's the hardest point of the game and the point where your honor mode runs are most likely to fail. Finally, it is still pretty rest dependent. While you get to smite based on your Warlock's short rest spells rather than a normal Paladin's long rest spells, so you're significantly less rest dependent than just a monoclass Paladin or a Paladin Sorcerer or a Paladin Bard multiclass. You still do require those short rests in order to get your high-level smites and your spells back, and you will often want to long rest to get your Paladin spell slots back as well, so you are still somewhat rest-dependent. You will run through short rests relatively quickly, and that will cause you to long rest more often. Of course, there are ways to mitigate this by refreshing your spell slots, but that is definitely a real downside of the character. Finally, I've listed just all the really broken stuff that every character gets access to. These wouldn't be the most powerful builds in the game if they didn't all break the game in some way, and so here is some broken stuff that this build gets to do. You get to abuse Darkness, which is one of the most powerful effects in the game, giving you advantage on all your attacks, your enemies disadvantage on all their attacks, and completely shutting down ranged enemies with no saving throw. You get to abuse Arcane Acuity, where you hit an enemy and then stack up Arcane Acuity, and then potentially use bonus actions to increase your save DCs for really high-level commands. Because you can use your Warlock spell slots on command, you can often take out 5 enemies without take out 5 enemies with a high-level command, allow that they can't possibly resist because of your Arcane Acuity stacking. And you get to stack Charisma because Charisma is just the attribute that you can get highest in the game, so builds that are based off of Charisma are very good. I actually also failed to put in the strengths that you get good dialogue skills, another important thing about this character. So that's the Lock It In. Let's go on to character number 10. In number 10, I have placed the Moon Druid. Moon Druid is, I think, the most powerful of the 3 druids because of its ability to bonus action Wild Shape, which makes it significantly more resilient, giving you a lot more effective hit points, and also lets it use the very powerful play pattern of casting one of Druid's incredible concentration spells, and then Wild Shaping, and then subsequently just beating the crap out of enemies in a fight. The great thing about a Moon Druid is that it is the best early game character in the game, in my opinion. From levels 1 to 3, Moon Druid is going to make your playthrough smoother than just about any other character. Between Spider Form and game-winning spells like Spike Growth, you will be able to just carry pretty much any party through the early game, and so having access to this character makes the hardest part of the game an awful lot easier. Moon Druids are also very tanky because they get multiple hit point bars, both since the enemy needs to reduce their wild shape form to 0 and then also their humanoid form to 0 to kill them. And they have access to a bunch of fight-winning spells, especially in the early game, things like Spike Growth, but also Plant Growth, and then later on, things like Wall of Thorns can just instantly win fights on their own. If you aren't using camp casting, they also get Hero's Feast in the end game, so all throughout the game they have great spell progression and access to just completely fight-winning spells. Druids also get the best summons in the game, and summons are very powerful. Adding more bodies to your team is incredibly useful, of course, because just having more units on the field is incredibly good in and of itself, and Moon Druids get the best summons in the game because they will be able to apply to bring the Myrmidon summons, they'll be able to bring the Woodland Being summons, and those are the 2 best summon spells in the game, each of which is a game-winning spell on its own. They also need no specific items, and in fact can't even really use specific items, so they will never conflict with the rest of your party in terms of item access, and they only require a single attribute. They just need Wisdom in order to function, because all of your other attributes you just get from your wild shape form, so you don't particularly need to increase your attributes or do anything wacky in order to maximize the power of your character. Finally, they have great mobility because the wild shape forms, especially early game ones like the spider, come with excellent mobility, so you will be able to go wherever you want to in fights, which is always very useful. The downsides of Moon Druid are that they usually require a setup turn at the beginning of combat, where you are going to cast a spell with your main action and then enter Wild Shape with your bonus action, or enter Wild Shape with your bonus action and start attacking, which means you are either losing some power because you're not casting one of your high-level spells, or you are not attacking on your first turn of combat, so you have sort of a slightly less effective opening turn. Not that those turns aren't still very strong, those are still very good turns, but in some fights you will find that your druid has spent their first turn setting up, and then the fight is over by the time they get around to their second turn, and so they don't actually make any of their attacks. And also, while you're in wild shape form, you can often lose concentration on spells if your positioning isn't perfect, so you do have to be very careful about that, or invest resources into taking a feat like Constitution Resilient or Warcaster in order to prevent that. They also have relatively low burst damage for a damage-focused character, and especially for a melee damage-focused character, because when you're in melee form, you're going to be doing melee damage. but you mitigate that by mostly being a control and casting character that just also gets really good sustained damage. So the low burst damage is definitely a downside, but isn't as crippling as it would be for other melee characters. Broken options that Moon Druids get to abuse include the Tavern Brawler feat, which just doubles your strength to hit, which means you just never miss your attacks when you're in Wild Shape form. At time of recording, they don't, on Honor Mode, get their strength to hit twice, strength to damage twice in Wild Shape forms. Only their strength to their attack rolls gets doubled with Tavern Brawler, but that's the important part, so it's still just incredibly powerful to not miss your attacks, especially because some of the wild shapes, especially the late game wild shapes like the Earth Myrmidon, have incredible damage output, and they also get to abuse the wet condition, both by being really good at applying it and also by having a lot of lightning and cold damage in their arsenal that they can double with the wet condition, which is just incredibly powerful and can help you one-shot enemies very, very easily. Altogether, the Moon Druid is just a phenomenal addition to any party, especially parties with more late game oriented builds, or builds that with like squishy casters and stuff like that might need a little bit of help to get through the early game, because it is just so powerful in the early game and it makes your honor mode runs so much smoother. In position number 9, I have placed the Assassin Archer. This is, I think, the strongest way to build this character, the Gloomstalker Rogue, the Gloomstalker Ranger Assassin Rogue character, but there are some other builds, other variants of assassin-based archers will also fit neatly into this category, but this is my recommended build. Using Gloomstalker Ranger and Assassin Rogue gets you so many attacks because you get an attack when you enter combat, and then you get an additional attack on the first round of combat because Assassin Rogue refreshes your action, and an additional attack on the first round of combat because of Gloomstalker Ranger. All of that together means that you are attacking just way more times than other characters on the first turn of combat, and all of those attacks are automatic critical hits because of the Assassin Archer feature. That means that your burst damage on this character is second to none, and you can improve it even further by getting Action Surge from Fighter, Battlemaster maneuvers to increase your damage even more, or Champion criticals if you want to go for a more critical focus build, but the math generally supports using Battlemaster maneuvers. And to just get a character that pretty much one-turn kills any enemy in the entire game, making 6 or 8 attacks that automatically critical hit, that multiply your base damage, add your sharpshooter damage, hit very frequently because they're usually made with advantage and you get archery fighting style and so on, obviously is incredibly powerful, and so the strengths of this character I think should be mostly pretty obvious. What you're here for is burst damage. You do so much damage in the opening round of combat that almost nothing can survive, and if you can take out 1 or 2 or 3 enemies in the first turn of combat, that's a lot fewer enemies for the rest of your party to fight, especially if those enemies are the strongest enemies in the fight, which often they will be. Automatic critical hits not only is tons of damage, but also lets you trigger critical hit effects, and you just get way more attacks than other characters, which lets you trigger on-hit effects as well. But there are actually a bunch of parts of this character aside from the burst damage, a lot of strengths of this character aside from just the burst damage that make it even stronger, because it's strong in some very unintuitive ways as well. For example, this character is incredibly tanky. It will have very high armor class because it's a dexterity based armor with medium armor. You can use a shield in addition to your bow if you want to. And so you can have the highest armor class in the game. You get some damage resistances from Ranger. You can, so this character actually ends up surprisingly tanky for a dexterity character, and you also get great hit point progression because you have 9 levels of a d10 hit die from your Ranger levels and fighter dice. So this character gets a lot of hit points, high armor class, and a bunch of other stuff that just helps it be defensive, and because it's an archer, you will almost never get hit, so this character is incredibly survivable. You also get great utility spells and mobility because of your utility skills and spells because of your Ranger and Rogue levels, and great mobility because of your Rogue levels, giving you bonus action dashes and hides. So all of that together makes this character just a very smooth playthrough as well, because you can pick locks with it, you can make it your party face if you want, because it's also totally single attribute dependent. needing only high dexterity, and because it also needs feats, it often won't actually need to invest points into dexterity. So this character is going to end up just having a lot of attribute points. You can make it your party face, you can make it have 20 strength for no reason. You can do all kinds of cool stuff with the attributes bred on this character. Finally, you get some of the best initiative in the game because you get the Gloomstalker Ranger initiative bonus. You're a dexterity-based character. You can fit alert into the build pretty easily, so you'll pretty much always win initiative, which is of course excellent. The weaknesses of this character are basically that it's got a relatively slow early game. Not incredibly slow, but because you want to hit Ranger 5 and Rogue 3 before you get extra attack and critical hits, you have a few levels before you come into your full potential as a character. So maybe you're going to play it as a monoclass ranger for the first 5 levels, or take like 1 rogue level and then 5 ranger levels. So you don't get the full benefits of this build until later on in the build, but of course it's still a solid build throughout the early game. And also because it wants the sharpshooter feat and only gets 2 feats as you level up, you basically need the gloves of dexterity in order to maximize your dexterity. Playing this character with 18 base of dexterity is fine, so you could play it just as a sharpshooter character with a +2 dexterity, or use Ethel's hair or whatever, but the easiest way to play this character is with the gloves of dexterity, which lets you get another feat like alert, so you always win initiative and that kind of thing. So it has 1 item requirement and a relatively slow start in the early game, but in exchange for that you get some of the highest burst damage and best sustained damage in the game. Broken stuff, you can abuse stealth archery with greater invisibility, and that just instantly wins the game, basically, because enemies won't react to your presence at all. And of course, just being able to one-shot every enemy in the encounter before it starts is what makes this character so powerful. Weighing in at number 8, we have the Fire Sorcerer. So this uses Draconic Sorcerer and its ability to apply its charisma to damage of its associated element, alongside the spell Scorching Ray, which attacks many times per spell cast, to apply its charisma to its spell damage multiple times per turn. With a 6-level Scorching Ray, which fires 7 beams, you get to apply your charisma 7 times to your damage. So the higher your charisma, the higher your damage. That means that this character does some of the highest burst damage in the game, especially because you're a sorcerer. So you can cast a Scorching Ray and then twin another Scorching Ray to apply your charisma even more times in a single turn. There are very few enemies in the game that can survive this burst damage, and so the Fire Sorcerer is just one of the best you get. So you get amazing burst damage from this character, but you also get all the other benefits of a sorcerer, like incredible control. You get some of the best control spells in the game, and you can concentrate on them pretty reliably because you're a sorcerer, so you have con save proficiency. You can quicken one and then still cast a fire ray or anything along those lines. And you can twin control spells as well for even more control, and you can twin buff spells, such as, for example, Haste, in order to buff your party, especially in fights where the enemy is immune to fire damage, or you just don't want to spend high-level spell slots on killing stuff. You always have amazing backup options. Because you're a sorcerer, you get the best action economy in the entire game, be able to take up to like 5 turns in a single turn if you do a quicken spell, and then a hasted twin spell, and then a hasted twin spell, and then a quicken spell. You can cast 5 spells in a single turn and just completely obliterate encounters by just unloading your entire arsenal in a single turn. And you're also, for that reason, the best at using items and scrolls because you can quicken the spells cast off of them. And again, I didn't mention this here, but one of the best in the game at using illithid powers for the same reason, because you can use your spells and illithid powers in the same turn. Not that you can quicken illithid powers, but you can use them alongside other spells as well. You also get access to the charisma skills because you're a sorcerer, which is a great thing for a party to have access to, and all of the other sorcerer goodies as well. But the main thing is that you just do so much upfront damage and are so good at one-shotting enemies with your high charisma-based burst damage that very little is going to survive if you have the spell slots to unleash on them. The downsides of this character do include those spell slots. Because you need 6th or 5th level spells to maximize your charisma damage, this character is relatively rest dependent. You're going to want to refresh your spell slots frequently. So this character is going to cause your party to rest more often in order to refresh its high damage combos. Not that this character can't contribute when it doesn't have high level spell slots, but in order to use your extremely high damage in a given combat, you're going to need high level spell slots available, and you're relatively squishy because you need to be a high level sorcerer. Sorcerers get the lowest hit points in the game, and you'll often be in robes, so you probably won't have great armor class. So this character does give you some risk to your party if you misposition it or are taken by surprise in some way. Enemies can get the drop on you. The sorcerer does get access to, aside from just the brokenness of the way that Draconic Sorcerer's Charisma is added to damage, you also get to use Arsonist's Oil to strip fire resistance off of enemies, or even give fire vulnerability to non-fire resistant enemies through the convoluted process of applying water to them, hitting them with Arsonist's Oil, and then waiting for the water to expire, but that can cause enemies to become weak to fire, doubling all your fire damage. You also get some of the easiest stacks of Arcane Acuity in the entire game, which makes your spells hit extremely reliably, and then also your control spells work 100% of the time. And similar to the Lock-It-In, everything's based on Charisma, which is one of the best stats in the game to base things on, because you can boost your Charisma higher than any other stat in the game, and since you're applying your Charisma 7 times in a turn, having high charisma means that you can absolutely crush encounters because of how high it's possible to get your charisma. Altogether, this is the character to take if you just want to kill things stone dead, because it will just set the entire world on fire. It's so good at killing things that it will obliterate most boss encounters on its own in the very first turn, and absolutely make any honor mode run a breeze. Coming in at number 7, I have placed Clerics. Yep, just Clerics. Cleric as a class is just that good. In particular here, I'm thinking of Light Clerics, Tempest Clerics, or Nature Clerics. Of those, Light is probably the strongest for honor mode runs because of Warding Flare just being an extremely powerful ability, but any of those 3 Cleric variants, if taken for 12 levels, will be an excellent addition to any party. Clerics have some of the best spell access and utility spells in the entire game, and access to a bunch of, the easiest access to a bunch of broken mechanics that other characters have a slightly harder time using or need to warp their items in order to use. Clerics just get to use them by default. They also just make your run so much smoother with access to the incredible utility spells that clerics get. Things like guidance and whatever are just really good for your party. Aid and Hero's Feast and so on are always very, very powerful for a party. Obviously, you can cast those from a camp caster, but if you're not using camp casting, then a cleric bringing those is really good as well. Clerics have amazing control, especially the 3 types of clerics that I mentioned. They are very, very hard to kill because of their medium or heavy armor and shields, and if they're in medium armor, of the 3 clerics I mentioned, they also have Warding Flare to defend themselves. They get to abuse the buff on heal items using like Mass Cure Wounds in order to apply Blade Ward and Bless to your entire party, and they also just get Bless as a spell, which just makes your early game so much easier. The strengths of Cleric are basically that they can fill any role in your party incredibly well, and they can fill all the roles in your party incredibly well, with the exception of not having great access to skills, especially conversation skills or out-of-combat utility like lockpicking. But in terms of combat roles, your cleric can fill any role and do it tremendously effectively while bringing a whole bunch of extra power to the table. They get some really great item support, so it lets you use some of the most powerful items in the game more easily. Clerics, they're just awesome. The weaknesses of clerics are, of course, that they are rest dependent because they're spellcasters, so without spells they don't do anything, and they have relatively poor skill access, as I just discussed. Especially the 3 most powerful cleric subclasses don't get great access to skills, and so you are going to not be as easily able to it will somewhat constrain the other party members that you take, in that you will need to fill out the conversation skills and lockpicking, utility, stealth, and so on elsewhere in your party if that's something that you want access to. You can somewhat mitigate this, by the way, by taking a race that has access to perception as a skill, because then if your cleric starts with perception, then they're actually bringing a very important skill to your party, and since they'll have high wisdom, they get to do that. Clerics also, of course, an unlisted strength here is that clerics get to take alert at level 4. It doesn't hurt them at all to do that, and so you will just get to patch the only other weakness of the class at level 4 by taking the bonus initiative, which means that you'll just always win initiative. Clerics also give you access to some of the most broken mechanics in the game, the stacking mechanics, because using Spirit Guardians, they can apply Radiant Orbs and Reverberation and max out those stacks instantly on enemies, preventing bosses from attacking. Maxed Radiant Orbs basically completely shuts down a boss, and there's no saving throw against applying those, and then Reverberation can knock over entire encounters, so it is very, very easy for your cleric to just single-handedly shut down every enemy in the entire game, thanks to the broken item access that they just make so incredibly easy. For their versatility, power, utility, and just overall strength in a party, I think that clerics, even though it isn't like the fanciest build, it's just take 12 levels of cleric, 12 levels of cleric is pretty darn good. Coming in at number 6, just shy of reaching the top 5, but obviously still an insanely powerful build, we have the Lightning Lord. This build uses 2 levels of Wizard, usually for Divination Wizard, 2 levels of Cleric for Tempest Cleric, and 8 levels of Sorcerer in order to cast maximized Witch Bolts or Chromatic Orbs on enemies to do enormous amounts of damage in a single turn. Because you have Sorcerer levels, you can quicken Create Water to double the damage, and then you can use Tempest Cleric to maximize the damage of your lightning damage, which means that with a 6th-level Witch Bolt and a Create Water spell, this character can do a guaranteed 300 damage to any enemy with a single spell cast. More if you can get an ally to apply the Create Water so that you don't have to spend your bonus action quickening it on an enemy. You can also twin your spells, so you can use Mark of Heshkir incredibly well for twinned Chain Lightning, and you can twin Chromatic Orbs on multiple enemies for even more damage output, so you basically get to one-shot either the most threatening or the 2 most threatening enemies in just about every encounter on the first turn of combat. 300 damage is so much guaranteed damage that there are very few enemies in the game that can survive it, and thanks to Divination Wizard giving you Portent Dice, you'll be able to know in advance. You'll be able to guarantee hitting the enemies if you happen to roll low and miss an attack. And so and you can also increase this even further with critical hits using Luck of the Far Realms or the Killer Sweetheart Ring, guaranteed critical hits on your using Luck of the Far Realms for guaranteed critical hits to do even more damage, which then gets doubled and maximized and so on. The sheer amount of burst damage that this character does is nonsensically high and is enough if you spend resources on it to just completely one-shot any enemy in the game. There's actually very few enemies that just have enough base health to survive this at all. And the ones that do, of course, you will still have done more than half of their health most of the time. And the ability to burst down the most dangerous enemies in the game doesn't really need any more praise from me. Obviously, killing every enemy in one shot is pretty good. You also get all the utility of these classes. You're an 8th level sorcerer, so you get all of the sorcery utility spells as well as dialogue skills if you want them. You get defensive options like shield and counterspell, and you get to con save, so you'll maintain concentration, and you get all the utility of being a cleric, and all the utility of having every wizard spell at your disposal. Because of the way wizards scribe spells, you just get to learn every spell in the game. So you have great damage, great utility, great control. You have access to twinned haste, so you can just, similar to the Fire Sorcerer, you can cast up to 5 spells in a turn, and if you get your ally to apply Wet for your combo, you can combo down multiple enemies in the opening turn of combat, or just cast a bunch of powerful control spells if that's what's called for in that combat. All of those options make this character incredibly powerful because of the sheer amount of damage and utility that it provides. Weaknesses of the character: you are relatively squishy. You do get heavy armor access, so you're not as squishy as, and shield proficiency. You're not as squishy as some other casters, but still relatively squishy, and rest dependent because you need to use your high level spell slots for the combo. I will say that one misconception about this kind of build and the Fire Sorcerer build is that they are more rest dependent than other casters, but that's actually not true. in a fight where you spend a 6th level spell slot to instantly kill the most powerful enemy in that combat, any other caster would have probably spent as many or more spell slots in order to win that combat. So you are actually more sustainable over the course of the day with these one-shot combo characters than other characters are, but still you need those spell slots in order to fight, so you are rest dependent, and you have a relatively slow early game because this build really wants to be at least level 4 before it comes online, and before you reach the breakpoints where your damage starts one-shotting people is somewhere around like level 7 when you get access to 4th level spell slots. So this character does have a relatively slow early game, but of course you're still just a cleric, sorcerer, or wizard, so you can play just normally in the early game using clouds of daggers and magic missiles and stuff to get you through the early game, but the real combo doesn't come online until a little bit later. This broken stuff column looks relatively thin because there's really only one mechanic that we're abusing here, but this character's the best in the game at abusing it, and that's the wet mechanic. Doubling the sheer amount of damage that we do means that the damage increase we're getting from wet is absolutely absurd. So this character just completely obliterates enemies using this broken mechanic, which is one of the best things that you can be doing in Baldur's Gate 3. And here we are entering our top 5. Weighing in at number 5, we have the Abjuration Wizard. Abjuration Wizard uses Armor of Agathys combined with stacking Arcane Ward to have extremely high temporary hit points and extremely high damage reduction and effectively be invincible. The way that Arcane Ward works in Baldur's Gate 3 means that it reduces the amount of damage that is incoming towards your character enormously and is very easy to replenish just by casting more Abjuration spells in combat. And so if combats go long, this character can tank literally thousands of damage without ever taking a scratch. The strengths of this character are simple. It is invincible. It is almost impossible for this character to die in a normal combat of Baldur's Gate 3. You have to like go AFK and pass the turn many, many times once you have your combo set up. For an enemy to actually be able to kill you. You will never lose concentration on spells because it's very rare that you'll actually take any damage at all from enemies. Especially once you've applied damage reduction like Blade Ward or Warding Bond to your character. You get great control spells as well as that because you are still just a fully functional wizard. You're an 11th level wizard, so you have access to some of the best control spells in the game and just great spell access in general. But mostly the reason that this character is so good is just that you are a wizard doing normal wizard things, but you're completely unkillable, and that is just an incredible thing to be. A wizard is a really powerful thing for a character to be, but wizards do have inherent drawbacks. Not Abjuration wizards, there are no drawbacks to this character's. One other fun thing about this character is that enemies will often ignore you and just completely ignore your character, so you can just waddle into the middle of enemies with impunity. And you get incredibly consistent damage because you can get enemies wet in some way to double cold damage that they take, and then provoke opportunity attacks by moving next to them and then moving away. They'll hit you, dealing 0 damage because of your Arcane Ward, and then they take 60 return damage from the Armor of Agathys that you get from being a White Draconic Sorcerer. All of those together are just make this character incredibly consistent damage, incredibly consistent control, very, very, very hard to lose the game with, and that is something that I value pretty highly, so Abjuration Wizard comes in at number 5. Weaknesses of this character: you are relatively rest dependent. If enemies do hit you a lot, then you need to cast spells to refresh your Arcane Ward, so you'll then need to rest to gain those spell slots back. And the other downside is that enemies will ignore you. You are a tank, so you would prefer if enemies attacked you, but it's actually somewhat difficult to get them to focus on this character. Some easier ways to do that are to give them advantage on attacks with things like the Risky Ring, or mostly by just provoking opportunity attacks on purpose, to both eat enemy reactions and to to increase your damage. The broken stuff that this character is doing is the wet condition, because wet is just very good. You're just going to double your cold damage output with your Armor of Agathys for just a guaranteed 60 damage whenever enemies hit you, which they're going to do very frequently. And Arcane Ward, which is the whole thing that this spell is that this build is based around, is just an incredibly broken mechanic, so abusing it is one of the absolute most powerful things that you can do in an honor mode run. If you are looking for a caster, but you have found that your casters are dying, don't worry, this one never will, so this is the perfect caster for you. Coming in at number 4, we have the Berserker Barbarian Thrower. This build uses Berserker Barbarian and its ability to throw weapons as a bonus action, combined with Thief Rogue and its ability to make more bonus actions to enter a Berserk Rage and then throw an awful lot of weapons every turn. You can add Fighter in for even more attacks, which is extremely powerful, as well as Eldritch Knight's ability to bond a weapon if there's a weapon that you want to throw that doesn't normally have the returning property. This lets you do some of the most consistent and powerful damage in the entire game because of Tavern Brawler being so broken. Thrown weapons get to use Tavern Brawler, and thrown weapons get to be ranged, so you get to apply Tavern Brawler at range, which is really awesome. And that means that your attacks basically never miss. You get an awful lot of attacks every turn because you're making your attacks with making fully featured and in fact even more powerful than normal attacks with your 2 bonus actions. And then you also get Action Surge once per fight to do even more attacks. So you're getting tons of attacks, your attacks never miss, they do more damage than just about any other martial character in the game. And your bonus action attacks give you a free prone every single turn, or 2 once you have Thief Rogue and can make multiple attacks per turn in later rounds of combat, which can disrupt enemy spellcasters, give advantage to subsequent attacks from the rest of your party, and just overall be an incredibly powerful tool for adding in some control to this already incredibly damaging character. You also, of course, you're a barbarian. You enter a barbarian rage, you're a fighter, you've got fighter abilities, you can be in medium armor and whatever, and so you get to be pretty tanky overall, especially for a ranged attacker, and you get great utility skills because you're a rogue, so you get access to lockpicking or other utility skills. You can even have this character play as your party face if you want and just start with a rogue level. So this character can be built in a lot of ways that actually bring a lot of utility to your party. You also get the bonus action dashes and hides from Rogue, which makes you quite mobile. Not that you really need to be, because you are a ranged character that never misses, so you don't really need to move that often, but the sheer amount of damage that this character outputs just makes it ridiculous. The weaknesses of this character, there are some. The strengths are just so strong that they overcome all of these weaknesses, in my opinion, but there are some actual weaknesses to this character. One is that you do require a setup turn because you have to enter Rage. So in the early game, that's going to cost you your bonus action, and you won't be able to make an automatic prone attack on the first turn of combat because you will have spent your bonus action raging instead of throwing with your Berserker Barbarian throw. In later turns, that's just going to cost you 1 throw because the rogue bonus action will give you a second one, but you do have a setup turn where you do less damage than the rest of the combat, and it's always better to front load your damage if possible, so even a slight setup turn definitely does make this character a little bit harder to play sometimes. And you get delayed access to alert because you have to take Tavern Brawler at level 4, so this character won't be able to get alert until at earliest level 8. Usually level 9, which means that you will often lose initiative with this character if you don't invest heavily into initiative items or elixirs of vigilance and so on, which is sometimes difficult to do because this character also really wants to use strength elixirs. That's what makes this level split viable, because otherwise you would need to take Barbarian 8, Rogue 4 in order to actually hit 20 strength. So this build really does want to use strength elixirs. You can build it without them, but it is a weaker version of the build if you aren't drinking an elixir of Hill Giant strength every day. Broken stuff is pretty obvious for this character. You get Tavern Brawler, which is just an incredibly broken feat, makes your attacks hit 100% of the time, basically. Makes them do way more damage than any other character's attacks in the game do, and these are fully featured weapon attacks, so they're also just doing all the damage and effects of your weapons. You get to throw weapons, which is just powerful in and of itself in Baldur's Gate, because it applies all the effects of the weapon, but at range, so you get to do just more damage than most characters. And you get strength elixirs, which are broken because they let you get dozens of attribute points and 2 feats for free if you just drink an elixir of strength every day. That's an incredibly broken thing, and some of the best builds in the game are built around maximizing the power of the strength elixirs if you drink them every day. The other thing that I should mention about this character is that, while this is a slight spoiler, there is a bug currently with the final boss where when you target them with a thrown weapon, it often won't hit and then will disappear, and that's a real downside to the thrower builds, because you turn into a melee character for the last battle in the game. But if you know about that going in advance, you can play around the bug, and hopefully they'll fix that eventually. Coming in at number 3, and I expect this one's going to surprise some people because I bet this was a lot of people's pick for number 1, we have the Open Hand Monk. Honestly, the difference between these top 5 characters is so thin that you could reorder these and I'd be happy with pretty much any order, but I think that the Open Hand Monk does have one downside that lets the next 2 builds edge it out very slightly, but that is just that pales in comparison to just how broken this build is. Using levels of Monk and Thief Rogue, and with Open Hand Monk specifically, you get 2 additional bonus actions in a round, which you can use for Flurry of Blows, which lets you by default make 8 attacks in a turn using a Monk 9 Rogue 3 build, or 10 attacks in a turn using a Fighter build, and all of those attacks will almost never miss because you get to abuse Tavern Brawler. All of those attacks will do massive damage because you get to abuse Tavern Brawler, and Open Hand Monk gets damage steroids, and there's items that give you even more damage steroids. So this character, the amount of damage this character can do in a single turn becomes just ridiculous. It's extremely consistent and extremely powerful, and you get so many free crowd control effects from Open Hand Monk that you will very often just not ever learn what a boss does, even if it happens to live for a turn through your damage. You get to knock enemies prone or push them back for free multiple times per turn. You get to stun enemies multiple times per turn for basically for free. Obviously, both of those cost a key point, but that's hardly a resource, and you're incredibly mobile. So this character does some of the highest burst damage in the game, some of the highest sustained damage in the game, never misses its attacks, and just does so much for a party. Honestly, there's like not that much to say about the strengths of this character because it just has so many strengths when it comes to dishing out damage. It's the best melee character in the game by far, just crushes encounters all on its own. Only enemies who are immune to stun, of which there are very, very few in the game, are or if you roll badly, or enemies roll really well on their stun saves, are you ever going to actually have to play the game when you're playing an Open Hand Monk? So most of the time you're just going to completely obliterate the every encounter that this character enters. There are some downsides to this character. It's melee, which isn't as big a downside for this character because you're a rogue, so you have the extra dash and you have great mobility and jump distance and so on. You can almost always get into range of enemies and then leave range if you need to, but being melee is still a downside. It makes your positioning a little bit harder. And it is relatively squishy for a melee character. Monks get relatively low AC because they can't wear armor, and get relatively low hit points because they just have lower hit points. So you can have this character go down with focused attention from an enemy. That is certainly possible if an enemy happens to live through your turns. It's not something that happens often, but it does happen, and that's what makes this character just a little bit harder to play than the next 2 in the list. And then also you get you have to delay alert because you're taking Tavern Brawler at level 4, so you won't get alert until minimum level 8, and probably not until level 9 when you can have Monk 5 and Rogue 4 or something along those lines. So you are going to lose initiative sometimes, something that does put this character a little bit behind most of the other characters in the list that get to take alert very early and win initiative 100% of the time. And you are very multi-attribute dependent, which makes you item dependent, and in particular makes you strength elixir dependent. Monks can be played without using strength elixirs, but it's basically mandatory. You need 4 of the 6 attributes to be as high as possible, and so getting all of those stats from strength elixirs is basically mandatory to make this build work to its optimal effect. You can still make a very strong monk without abusing elixirs, but for the most part, the open hand monk build, especially like the 9-3 build or the 6-4-2 build, just have to drink an elixir every day. Broken stuff from this build, obviously Tavern Brawler, obviously Strength Elixirs, and also Stunning Strike, especially as implemented in Baldur's Gate, where it uses your Strength or Dexterity for its save DC, so the save DC is even higher than it is in Tabletop. But Stunning Strike's already just a completely broken mechanic. Just the ability to stun an enemy on a relatively high save DC without spending an action on it at all, because you just have to hit them, which you want to do anyways, so it's entirely action economy free to roll Stunning Strike, is just a broken mechanic that exists in Dungeons & Dragons, and this character gets to abuse it to perfection. If you just want to completely wipe the floor with every encounter, may I recommend 11 levels of Fighter and 1 level of War Cleric, or possibly 12 levels of Fighter, to just make as many thrown weapon attacks in the opening round of combat as you can. You can throw any weapon, because you're the Eldritch, any weapon with the thrown property, because you're the Eldritch Knight, so you can do a weapon bond, which gives you a little bit more access to different items, but mostly the idea here is just that in the opening round of combat, you make 7 attacks once you are max level, because you get to throw 3 times with your main action, throw 3 times with your action surge, and then throw 1 more time with your cleric bonus action. Of course, you can increase this further with Bloodlust Elixirs or Haste or whatever. That means that you have basically the highest first turn burst damage in the game at maximum level, and it's really good all the way through. The obvious question to ask here is, why do I value the Eldritch Knight Thrower over the Berserker Thrower? And that burst damage is the answer. The Berserker Thrower in the first turn of combat can make 5 attacks, and the Eldritch Knight Thrower in the first turn of combat can make 7 attacks, so it's just more likely to end the encounter before it begins. On Honor Mode, especially in the late game, bursting down enemies in the first turn of combat is mostly all that matters, just killing them before they get to act, and the Eldritch Knight Thrower is basically the best character in the game at doing that. You operate from range, and you never miss your attacks, so with 7 attacks that do some of the highest per attack damage in the game, because you're using Tavern Brawler, probably have a Cloud Giant Elixir for tons of damage, and get to add all the damage bonuses from your weapon and your gear and so on, because these are all weapon attacks, since they're thrown weapons. You just do the most damage of just about any character in the game, incredibly reliably and incredibly sustainably. Your War Cleric charges will go away, and eventually you'll run out of action surges, of course, but 3 attacks with the Eldritch Knight Thrower every subsequent turn of combat is still incredibly powerful, and more than enough to get through most combats. So the strengths of this character are sustained damage, as well as incredible burst damage, and you are also one of the hardest characters in the entire game to kill. Being an Eldritch Knight means that you will have access to heavy armor and the shield spell, so you can easily be in the mid-30s in terms of armor class. So if you're not confident in your positioning, this character is perfect, because it's very, very hard for it to die. And so that's what I think gives it the very slight edge over the open hand monk, is just that if you accidentally hit spacebar and end your turn or something, the Eldritch Knight Thrower won't die, and there's a possibility that the monk will in that sort of circumstance where something goes terribly wrong. So this character, I think, is just so good at getting through Honor Mode, and so safe to play and so reliable, kills enemies so easily, that it is my number 2 pick for Honor Mode. You also get a couple utility spells that's worth mentioning. You get to have Long Strider and Enhanced Leap from your fighter, which is not a 0. And like the Berserker Barbarian, this one does suffer from the final boss bug, so just be aware of that going in. We've talked about the broken stuff already, but you get to abuse strength elixirs. Unlike the Berserker, this the Eldritch Knight doesn't have to. You can still max out your strength, get alert, and Tavern Brawler with just the 3 feats that you get access to, because Fighter gets an extra feat at level 6. And you don't delay access to alert that much, because you still get it at level 6. So it's just a smoother level progression, but obviously both of those builds are incredible. And that will bring us to our first place position, my pick for the best character to play through Honor Mode with, and that is, of course, the Swords Bard Archer. Swords Bards, when using ranged attacks, get to use Slashing Flourishes to just double all of their ranged attacks, and so when you are doing twice as many attacks as any other character, you are going to easily win the game. Swords Bard Archers get to abuse some of the most broken mechanics in the game, as well as just having an incredibly powerful kit at their disposal. They have utility skills, they have utility spells, they have control spells, they have amazing sustained damage because they're archers, they have amazing burst damage because they get to burn their inspirations to do tons of extra damage. If you take a Fighter 2 split, then you can do even more attacks in the opening round of combat. You get to make more attacks than anybody else, basically. So you are also just the best user for any buffs that increase your damage output, and just basically get to be better casters than the casters and better fighters than the fighters. The fact of the matter is that there's not that much to discuss about Swords Bard Archer's strengths, because name a strength in the game and they are better at that than characters that are spec'd specifically into doing that thing. Better archers than archers, better casters than casters, better melee fighters than melee fighters, even if you're spec'd into archery. The list honestly just goes on, and you can do pretty much anything, because Slashing Flourish, just letting you make multiple attacks, the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, and the Helm of Arcane Acuity, letting you land spells with 100% guaranteed efficiency as a bonus action, the fact that you are a full level Bard, so you get access to all of Bard's skill access to all of Bard's spell access, means that there is just nothing that this character cannot do, and it will solo the game, basically, with even the slightest amount of party support. Of course, it's also a totally viable character to play if you do want to actually solo the game. The Swords Bard Archer just does everything. Your positioning mostly doesn't matter, because you're an archer and you have incredibly powerful spell access, and you get access to all the best spells in the game because of magical secrets that you get at level 10. Overall, this character just does way too much, all wrapped into a single package, and all of the things it does are individually better than characters that are specifically spec'd into trying to do those things. There are some weaknesses to the Swords Bard Archer. Most notably, it is squishy. You're still a Bard. You've taken all of your levels in Bard, but you do get a lot of good defensive options despite being a Bard, especially if you dip one level into like Sorcerer or Wizard, because then you can pick up Shield as well. And you're going to be in medium armor. You're going to be a dexterity character. You will be able to wear a shield if you want, so you'll have great AC. So while you have lower hit points than most other characters, especially characters that are sort of martial by default, you still are going to be relatively hard to kill. And the other weakness is that you do want the Sharpshooter feat, and so in order to, you will probably need the Gloves of Dexterity. You can take Sharpshooter and then just +2 Dex, or Sharpshooter +2 Dex and Ethel's Hair to reach 20 Dexterity. But for the most part, you are going to need at least one item in order to make up your attribute deficit, and especially if you don't want to spend a second feat on boosting your dexterity and instead get something like Alert, which of course is incredibly powerful for this character as well. This character does delay access to Alert a little bit. I guess I didn't put that in the weaknesses, but you're a dexterity character, so that matters a lot less for you than it does for other characters. And you get to abuse broken stuff like Arcane Acuity and Band of the Mystic Scoundrel. With the Helm of Arcane Acuity, you can stack your Arcane Acuity instantly by using Slashing Flourishes with your attacks, or by using an Arrow of Many Targets. And then with your bonus action, you can cast an enchantment spell like Hypnotic Pattern, just to wipe out any enemies in the encounter who remain, with save DCs that are infinitely high so that enemies can never pass them. After your first turn of combat, where you will always win initiative, there will never be any enemies left who can act when you're playing the Swordsbard Archer. You can either get command from Magical Secrets at level 10, or take 1 level of Warlock for command. Either way works just fine. Because it'll still keep you with charisma as your casting stat, and this character just does everything all in a single package. There is basically no downside to playing it, and all upsides. Being a Swordsbard is broken, and it is the best character in the game. My #1 build for Honor Mode. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the top 11 builds for Honor Mode for Baldur's Gate 3. You might be wondering why 11, and the answer is just, I couldn't narrow it down, honestly. I felt like not mentioning any one of these builds would be doing people a disservice when they were looking for strong builds, and there's obviously tons and tons of builds that I didn't mention that are still incredible. If one of your favorite builds didn't make the list, definitely let me know in the comments. Obviously, the top, like, 500 builds or so for Honor Mode are all amazing, and which different people's lists are going to reflect their playstyle or different things that they value. Maybe you don't care about passing dialogue checks as much as I do, or maybe you don't care about not long resting all the time as much as I do, or maybe you care way more about those things, and so what you value in a build might be a little bit different, but I think that these builds will be an amazing primer if you are just looking for a good starting point to build strong, powerful parties around that get to abuse some of the most broken mechanics in Baldur's Gate. As always, if you have enjoyed the video, leave a like, that helps me out a ton with the algorithm, and leave a comment, let me know what you think, and you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.